Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Instead of surviving the past, we're busting it. Because almost everything you think you know about Tudor England, the velvet and the codpieces, the black teeth and the burning witches, is either exaggerated, garbled, or flat out invented by someone who never actually lived there. Tonight we gently hold a candle to the biggest lies about Tudor England, the ones you've been repeating at dinner parties with total confidence, and we find out what was really going on behind all that ruffled linen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your suggestions genuinely shape everything that happens here, and this whole thing only keeps growing because of the quiet, thoughtful people who keep sending them in. The channel is also on Spotify now, so if you'd rather drift off with your eyes closed and your phone face down, the link is waiting in the description. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always around 2 a.m. for somebody. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered whether Tudor people really believed a bath would kill them? Whether everyone dropped dead the moment they turned 30, right around the age you started reading the fine print on your insurance? Did they all have rotten black teeth? Or was that just the influences of the day showing off? Did they marry at 12? Believe the earth was flat and burn a witch every other Tuesday? Or have we all been quietly lied to by centuries of bad textbooks, worse films, and one very famous email your aunt forwarded back in 2001? Well, tonight we find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1542 on a scratchy linen pillow in a country that's nothing like the one in the movies. The truth, as usual, is stranger, funnier, and far less romantic than the legend. Let's begin. You wake up, you do the mental math, and you panic. You're somewhere in your late 30s, which the internet has assured you means that in Tudor terms you should already be a fond memory and a damp patch in the churchyard. Everyone knows the average life expectancy back then was about 30, right? Here's the twist nobody prints on the sad little infographics. That number is being dragged into the gutter by heartbreaking infant mortality. If you survived the gauntlet of childhood, you had a very reasonable shot at your 50s, your 60s, even your 70s. The village is full of wrinkled, opinionated old people who remember 3 monarchs ago and will absolutely tell you about all of them. So no, waking up here isn't a death sentence. It just feels like one before your first drink of the day. Here's how the math actually breaks. Imagine 2 babies. One dies before its first birthday, which back here happens tragically often. The other lives to a grand and creaky 70. Add those together, divide by 2, and a modern calculator smugly announces an average life expectancy of 35. Despite the fact that not one person in the example actually died at 35. That is the trick your school textbook quietly pulled on you. The scary number isn't a typical lifespan, it's the bruise left behind by all those tiny graves. So who are the actual old people here? Everywhere, once you start looking. Grandmothers ruling kitchens with an iron ladle. Grandfathers dispensing unsolicited opinions from the warmer seat by the fire, which they will not be surrendering, thank you. Priests, landowners, and craftsmen who have been quietly outliving everyone's expectations for decades. Reaching 60 wasn't a miracle worthy of a saint's day. It was simply what happened if the plague, the childbirth bed, a festering wound, and a bad winter all failed to get you first, which, against the odds, they sometimes did. Now let's be fair, because we do try to be honest here. Growing old in Tudor England was not the cushioned, moisturised retirement you're vaguely dreading and secretly looking forward to. There were no reading glasses worth the name, no hip replacements, No gentle little pills lined up in a plastic organizer with the days of the week printed on it. Your teeth were largely a rumour. Your joints predicted the weather with grim accuracy. And there was no pension, no quiet cottage, no cruise. You worked until you physically couldn't, then leaned on your children and prayed they were the generous sort. But the point stands, and it's worth letting it sink into your Tudor pillow. The idea that everyone here dropped dead the moment they blew out 30 candles, right around the age you started groaning when you stand up and reading the small print on your insurance, is simply false. People grew old. They just did it the hard way, without ibuprofen and without complaining nearly as much as you would. So the next time some confident soul at a dinner party informs you that nobody used to live past 30, you may smile the serene, faintly smug smile of a person who has done the reading. You would not have been ancient at your age here. You'd have been a perfectly ordinary adult with a few good decades still ahead of you, assuming you kept your head down and your wounds clean. And speaking of things that have been unfairly slandered by the centuries, let's talk about washing. The story goes that Tudor people were walking compost heaps who bathed once at birth, once at marriage, and once, reluctantly, on the way to the grave. It's a fun story. It's also mostly nonsense. The people around you wash their hands and faces daily, often more than once, and they're weirdly obsessed with clean linen. That fresh white shirt against the skin is doing the job we now hand to the shower, quietly wicking away sweat and grime, and it's changed as often as a person can afford. Wealthy houses have bathtubs, sweetened water, and herbs. Nobody here thinks stinking is a virtue. They just think about cleanliness a little differently than you do, standing there wondering where on earth the taps are. Start with the linen, because linen is the whole secret. To a Tudor, wearing a clean white shirt or shift under your outer clothes was cleaning yourself. The fabric absorbed the day's sweat and oil, and a respectable person changed it regularly and had it laundered, boiled, beaten, and dried in the sun until it was blindingly white. A dazzling collar and clean cuffs were how you signalled to the world that you were a decent, well-kept human being. It was the 16th century version of a fresh haircut and a suit that actually fits. The dirt they cared about was the dirt other people could see. Then there's the daily maintenance, which would look oddly familiar to you. People rinsed their hands before and after eating, which mattered enormously in a world where you shared dishes and ate largely with your fingers. They washed their faces, scrubbed their teeth after a fashion with cloths and pastes, combed their hair obsessively to evict unwelcome tenants, and dabbed themselves with scented waters if they could afford them. Rosewater was practically a personality. This is not the behaviour of a people who had collectively given up. Full immersion in a tub was rarer. That part is true, and it wasn't a nightly ritual. Heating enough water to fill a wooden tub was a genuine project involving buckets, fire, time, and at least one exhausted servant if you were lucky enough to have one. So a proper soak was a treat, not a routine. There had also once been public bathhouses, cheerfully nicknamed stews, but by Tudor times many had been shut down, partly over their reputation for less than hygienic extracurricular activities, and partly out of a genuine fear that lingering in hot water opened your pores and let disease waltz right in. That fear is where the grain of truth hides. Some Tudor thinkers really did worry that hot bathing was risky, so they leaned even harder on the linen and rinse approach instead. That is not the same as never washing. It's just a different theory of how to stay clean, arrived at by people doing their best without ever having heard the word germ. And make no mistake, they judged one another for smelling bad. A person reeking of stale sweat was gossiped about here exactly as they would be in your office. Sweetness of breath and body was taken as a sign of health and good character, which is precisely why the wealthy drowned themselves in perfumes while everyone else scrubbed with whatever they had. Nobody was proud of the funk. so the compost heap Tudor is a myth. These people fussed over their appearance, their linen, and their smell with a diligence that would put your rushed morning routine to shame. They simply did it with cloth and cold water and rose water instead of a power shower. Of course, all that face washing still left one part of them unmistakably of its time. Let's talk about the teeth. You run your tongue over your teeth, brace yourself, and prepare to look like a haunted picket fence. Everyone in Tudor England had black rotting stumps for teeth, correct? Not quite. Sugar was breathtakingly expensive, which meant the peasants chewing coarse bread and vegetables actually had fairly sturdy teeth, if a little worn down. The people with the truly catastrophic mouths were the rich, who could afford mountains of imported sugar and treated it like a personality trait. In fact, the most famous set of black teeth in the whole century belonged to a certain queen we'll get to later on. So the poorer you are here, the better your smile. It's the one and only category where being broke is quietly winning. Understand why, and the whole thing flips on its head. Cavities are largely a gift from sugar, and sugar in Tudor England is a rare imported luxury that costs more than most people will see in a year. If you're a peasant, your diet is bread, pottage, vegetables, a little dairy, some ale, and precious little sweetness. Your teeth might be ground down like old millstones by the grit in coarse flour, but they aren't rotting out of your skull in a sugary tide. Poverty for once is quietly protecting you. Now look at the wealthy and prepare for a strange sense of justice. They can afford sugar, so they eat it with the reckless enthusiasm of people who have discovered a new toy. They build it into sculptures, dissolve it into wine, and spread it onto everything short of the furniture. The result is a mouthful of decay so advanced it turns the teeth a deep, glossy black. Foreign visitors to the grandest courts left slightly stunned notes about it, and the most famous smile of the age belonging to a certain long-reigning queen was reportedly so darkened by sugar that it was hard for guests not to stare. And here is the part that should break your modern brain. Because black teeth signalled wealth, some fashionable people who could not actually afford much sugar blackened their teeth on purpose to look like they could. Picture that. Picture faking tooth rot as a flex, the way someone today might carry an empty designer bag to seem richer than they are. Vanity, it turns out, is eternal and profoundly stupid in every single century. None of this means Tudors ignored their teeth. They rubbed them with linen cloths, scrubbed with powders made from herbs, ground shells, and other cheerfully abrasive ingredients, rinsed with vinegar or sweet-smelling waters to fight the dreaded bad breath, and chewed herbs like sage to freshen up. It was a real routine, just one built on hope and folk wisdom rather than fluoride. What they did not have was a dentist in any sense you'd recognise. When a tooth went truly bad, your options were prayer, patience, or the barber surgeon, who would happily yank the offending tooth out with an iron tool by candlelight, with roughly the anaesthesia you'd get from biting down hard and thinking of England. A toothache here was not a minor annoyance to schedule around your week. Left alone, it could turn into an infection that genuinely killed you. So yes, keep your suspiciously intact, unfashionably pale smile to yourself. Down here it marks you as poor, which, for your teeth at least, is the best possible news. Just try not to grin too widely on your way out. And speaking of that doorway you have to fold yourself in half to get through, let's talk about how tall everyone supposedly was. You duck through a doorway built for a confident hobbit and conclude that Tudor people must have been the size of garden gnomes. The low beams, the short beds, the little suits of armour in museums all seem to agree. In reality, the average Tudor adult wasn't dramatically shorter than you, only an inch or two on average, and plenty of them would look you dead in the eye. The doorways were low to keep the heat in and the building materials down, not because the population was pocket-sized. The beds look short partly because people often slept propped up on bolsters, and partly because the fancy surviving ones were built to be admired, not stretched out in. Let's start with those murderous doorways, since your forehead is already filing a complaint. A low door and a low ceiling are simply good sense in a world with no central heating. Warm air rises, so the lower you keep the ceiling, the less precious heat you waste warming the empty space above everyone's heads. Timber and thatch cost money and labour too, so why build tall when short keeps you warmer and your purse fuller? The doorway wasn't measuring the population, it was managing the heating bill. The beds are the next false witness. Yes, many surviving Tudor beds look alarmingly short, and people love to conclude their owners must have been dinky little folk. But plenty of Tudor people slept semi-upright, propped against a mound of bolsters and pillows, either from habit, from a belief that lying flat was unhealthy, or simply because a fat stack of cushions was cosy. A bed built for a half-sitting sleeper doesn't need to be long. On top of that, the ornate carved beds that survived the centuries were showpieces, status symbols parked in the best room to impress visitors, not the humble cots most people actually stretched out on. Then there's the armour, shrunk down in its glass case, apparently tailored for a nervous 12-year-old. Two things are going on. First, armour was custom-made for a specific body, and the small sets that survived often belonged to boys, to slighter men, or were built for ceremony and parade rather than a full-grown warrior. Second, survivorship is a liar. The gear that lasted 500 years in a collection is not a random sample of the population. It's the fancy, the unusual, and the carefully preserved. When archaeologists actually measure the bones, the gnome theory collapses. The average Tudor man stood somewhere around 5'7", the average woman a little over 5'2", only modestly shorter than today, and the gap is mostly explained by childhood nutrition rather than some fundamental shrinkage of the species. Feed a Tudor child a modern diet, and they'd shoot up to meet you. Poor food in the growing years, not tiny genes, kept the averages down. And there were genuinely tall people striding around, some of them famous. The most notorious king of the whole era reportedly stood around 6'2", towering over his court, broad and imposing in exactly the way that made everyone very keen to agree with him. Nobody described him as a freakish giant from another race of men. He was just a tall guy in a room of normal-sized people. So no, you have not woken up in a village of collectible figurines. You're a perfectly average height here. You just keep forgetting to duck, which, frankly, is on you at this point. Now, once you've stopped rubbing your skull and stooping through every entrance like an apologetic heron, take a good look at what everyone around you is actually wearing. Picture Tudor England, and your brain probably renders everything in the colour of wet cardboard. A whole nation of mud-coloured peasants shuffling around under grey skies. That flat, joyless palette is a costume drama invention and a hangover from the Puritans who came stomping along later. Real Tudor streets were loud with colour. Even ordinary people loved a good red, a warm russet, a cheerful blue, whatever dye they could get their hands on. The rich, meanwhile, were absolute peacocks, dripping in scarlet, deep black that cost a fortune to produce, and glinting gold thread, also tightly regulated by law that your outfit literally announced your rank. Blame the movies and the Puritans for the grey slander. Later films needed the poor to look poor, and the past to look grim, so they dressed everyone in porridge. And the actual Puritans who arrived after the Tudors with their sober blacks and whites retroactively coloured our whole imagination of the period. But wander a Tudor market and your eyes would water from the colour. Dye was old technology and widely available. Madder gave you reds and warm oranges. Woad, and later indigo, gave you blues. Weld gave you sunny yellows. Even a working person's wool tunic could be a perfectly cheerful shade, because looking drab was nobody's goal. The trick was that the colour and the cloth told everyone exactly where you stood, and the government made very sure of it. Tudor England had sumptuary laws, a gloriously nosy set of rules dictating who was allowed to wear what. These laws policed fabrics, furs, and above all certain colours and materials, reserving the flashiest for the highest ranks. The whole point was to stop an upstart merchant from swanning about dressed like an earl and confusing everyone about the natural order of things. At the very top of the forbidden list sat a few legendary luxuries. Deep, true purple and cloth of gold were essentially royalty only, because the dye and thread were staggeringly expensive, and the message was blunt. This colour is not for you. Certain furs, like sable, were similarly gated. Even the colour black, which you might assume was the cheap default, was in its richest, deepest form one of the most expensive shades of all, because coaxing wool to hold a flawless dark black took repeated dyeing and serious money. A wealthy Tudor in perfect black was not being modest. He was quietly flexing. Think of it as a dress code with legal teeth. Today your workplace might frown at flip-flops, or a fancy restaurant might turn you away without a jacket, and the worst that happens is mild embarrassment. In Tudor England, dressing above your station could actually get you fined. Your clothes were your job title, your bank statement, and your family tree all stitched into one visible package. And stepping outside your lane was a small act of rebellion. The authorities took weirdly seriously, which is why fashion here was genuinely competitive and genuinely stressful. A rising family poured money into the finest cloth their rank would legally allow, tailored into elaborate sleeves, padded shoulders, and later those absurd, magnificent ruffs that turned eating soup into an extreme sport. You dressed not to express your inner self, that's a modern indulgence, but to broadcast your exact position in a rigid pecking order to every single person who glanced your way. So the drab grey Tudor is a myth twice over. These people were colourful, and their colour was so meaningful that it was regulated by law. It's the flashiest, most anxious dress code you'll ever have to wear. And of all the myths that got dressed up and locked away, none rattles around the imagination quite like the one waiting for us down in the dungeon. Somewhere in your imagination there's a rusty iron contraption locked around some poor woman while her husband gallops off to war with the only key jingling on his belt. It's a vivid image. It's also very largely fiction. Those grim metal belts you've seen in cartoons and dusty museum cases are mostly much later curiosities, jokes, fakes, or fantasy props made centuries after the Tudors were dust. There's almost no credible evidence that Tudor husbands were padlocking their wives before heading out the door. The whole idea says far more about the fevered imaginations of later collectors than it does about anyone actually living here. Follow the belt back through time, and it keeps failing to appear where the legend insists it should be. Rummage through Tudor records, wills, letters, court cases, the endless paperwork of nosy neighbours reporting each other for everything under the sun, and the iron chastity belt is conspicuously missing. For a device supposedly common enough to become a symbol of the age, it left behind a suspicious lack of actual belts and an even more suspicious lack of people mentioning them. Where the idea does show up early, it tends to arrive as a joke or a metaphor rather than a hardware catalogue. Writers used the image of a locked-up woman as satire, as a bawdy punchline, or as a poetic way to talk about jealousy and fidelity. It was a gag about controlling husbands and clever wives, not an instruction manual. And crucially, the jokes usually end with the wife owning a second key, or a helpful locksmith friend, because even the people telling them found the whole notion faintly ridiculous. The physical belts that made it into museums are the real scandal. A great many of them were manufactured in the 17 and 1800s, long after the Tudors, as curiosities, fakes, and titillating props for collectors who wanted a spicy relic of a supposedly barbaric past. Buyers were only too happy to believe their crude iron souvenir came from some grim Tudor bedroom, because it flattered their sense of how enlightened and modern they themselves were. Several famous examples have quietly been reclassified as much younger frauds. The belt tells you about the Victorian imagination, not the Tudor one. And consider the sheer impracticality for a moment, which the legend never does. An iron device worn constantly against the skin in an age without decent metalworking tolerances, antibiotics, or plumbing would be a fast track to infection, injury, and a genuinely dead spouse rather than merely a faithful one. No amount of jealousy makes killing your wife with a rusty contraption a winning strategy. Tudor people were many things, but they were not idiots about the basic mechanics of staying alive. So how did Tudor society actually police fidelity, since it certainly cared about it? With the far cheaper tools of religion, law, gossip, and reputation. The church thundered about sin, the courts could punish adultery, and above all the entire village was watching, ready to whisper. Your good name was a fragile, precious thing, and the fear of scandal did the job the mythical belt never had to. Social shame was the lock, and everybody held a key. The chastity belt, in short, is a story about a fantasy, dressed up in iron, and sold to later generations who wanted their ancestors to be crueler and stranger than they were. You can safely file it beside the beaked plague mask and the flat earth, in the drawer-marked things that sound perfectly Tudor and simply weren't. Now, with that particular lock sprung open, let's go looking for breakfast, because you've been lied to about that too. You brace yourself for a lifetime of sad grey slop, one endless bowl of misery passed down through the generations. The reality on your table is a lot more varied than the sad gruel legend suggests. Yes, there's pottage, that thick, comforting stew of vegetables and grains, and yes, there's a great deal of bread. But there are also peas and beans, onions and cabbages, eggs, cheese, apples, pears, berries in season, honey, and actual meat and fish more often than the misery merchants would have you believe, especially bacon, poultry, and whatever the river coughs up. The Tudor poor weren't feasting, but they weren't living on wallpaper paste either. Start with pottage, since it really is the beating heart of the peasant kitchen, and give it some respect. It isn't just grey mush. It's a savvy, endlessly flexible stew simmering away over the fire, built from grains like oats or barley, and bulked out with whatever the garden and the season provided. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans, herbs, and a little fat or bacon if you were lucky. It's warm, filling, and honestly it's the exact sort of humble, one-pot cooking that a modern food blogger would photograph in soft light and rebrand as a rustic peasant grain bowl at £14 a serving. Then there's the garden, which most rural families kept and which quietly did a lot of heavy lifting. A cottage plot could grow cabbages, onions, garlic, leeks, root vegetables, herbs, peas, and beans, and many kept a few chickens for eggs, plus maybe a pig fattening in the yard for the glorious day it became bacon, sausages, and every other scrap they could wring from it. Nothing was wasted. That pig was a walking pantry, and its slaughter was practically a festival. Meat wasn't the daily luxury it is for you, true, but it wasn't a once-a-year rumour either. Bacon and salted pork stretched through the year, poultry turned up more often than the legend admits, and the resourceful poor added rabbits, pigeons, and the occasional bird or beast that wandered too close to a trap. Some of it strictly legal, some of it very much not. Rivers and coasts handed over fish, eels, and shellfish, which mattered enormously because the church demanded fish on a startling number of days each year, on which meat was forbidden. Whether you liked it or not, you ate a lot of fish. Bread was constant, but not the fluffy white cloud you know. Poorer people ate darker, denser loaves of rye, barley, or maslin, a practical mix of grains, while fine white bread was a rich man's showpiece. It was heavy, chewy, filling, and it did the job. Wash it down with small beer, and a labourer had genuine fuel for a brutal day in the fields. And then there was the sweetness of the countryside, free for the effort. Honey from the hives since sugar was out of reach, apples, pears, plums, cherries, and hedgerow berries in their seasons, eaten fresh, dried, or baked into something. Nuts in autumn. It was seasonal and local in a way your supermarket only pretends to be, and it followed the calendar with an honesty that would shame a farmer's market. So no, the Tudor peasant was not spooning joyless gruel from a wooden bowl for 70 grim years. The diet was limited, repetitive, and utterly at the mercy of the weather and a bad harvest. But it was varied, seasonal, and for all its hardship, weirdly close to the wholesome, low-processed ideal that people now pay a fortune to imitate. But if you think the food was at least dull and flavourless, well, brace yourself, because that's our next comfortable lie. You assume the food here is beige in every possible sense, flavourless fuel eaten purely to survive. Tell that to a wealthy Tudor cook who'd be genuinely offended. The kitchens of the well-off went absolutely feral with flavour. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, cloves, saffron, pepper, all layered onto dishes with a heavy hand precisely because spices were expensive, and showing them off was the entire point. Meat arrived drenched in sweet and sour sauces, fruit turned up cheerfully in savoury pies, and sugar was sculpted into edible showpieces. Even ordinary cooking leaned hard on herbs, garlic, mustard, and vinegar. Understand the economics and the flavour makes sense. Spices travelled a punishing distance to reach an English kitchen, hauled across seas and continents at ruinous cost, which meant that dumping a fistful of pepper or a pinch of precious saffron into a dish was less about taste and more about screaming your wealth at your dinner guests. A heavily spiced table was a status symbol you could eat. The more exotic the seasoning, the louder the boast, so the rich seasoned with an enthusiasm that borders on aggressive. The flavour combinations would genuinely startle your modern tongue, because Tudor cooks adored mixing sweet and savoury in ways we mostly abandoned. They spiced meat with cinnamon and sugar, folded dried fruit into dishes of chicken and fish, and built sauces that were simultaneously tart, sweet, and warm with spice. A grand roast might arrive under a sauce thickened with breadcrumbs and sharpened with vinegar or verjuice, that tangy juice pressed from unripe grapes, then perfumed with ginger and cloves. It was bold, layered, complicated cooking, not the timid, boiled dinner of legend. And then there was the theatre, because a Tudor feast was as much a show as a meal. The kitchens of the truly rich produced subtleties, elaborate sculptures made of sugar, marzipan, and pastry, shaped into castles, beasts, ships, and coats of arms, wheeled out to make the guests gasp. Food was carved, gilded, coloured, and arranged to dazzle the eye long before it reached the stomach. Your carefully plated brunch, photographed from directly above for the internet, is a faint, sad echo of what these people were doing to show off 500 years ago. Even the seasoning of the ordinary kitchen was livelier than you'd think. The poor couldn't touch imported spice, but they weren't eating in flavourless silence. They had onions, garlic, and leeks by the armful, a whole herb garden of parsley, sage, thyme, fennel, and mint, plus mustard, vinegar, and salt to wake a dish up. Pottage seasoned with herbs and a little bacon is not bland. It's just cheap. A clever cook with a garden and a salt box could make a humble pot of vegetables taste like something you'd actually want to eat. The one thing genuinely missing was the New World cast of ingredients that now defines so much of how we cook. No chili peppers to bring the heat, no tomatoes for a rich red sauce, no potatoes to soak everything up, because these were only just beginning to trickle across the ocean and hadn't yet conquered the English plate. So Tudor food tasted different from yours, sometimes strangely so, but different is not the same as boring. So put the bland food myth to rest with the rest of them. The rich ate like theatrical, spice-drunk show-offs, and even the poor knew their way around a herb garden. Nobody down here was chewing sadly on grey, unseasoned nothing and calling it dinner. And of all the ingredients these people fussed and flexed over, none carried more weight, more status, or more sheer strangeness than one white crystal. Speaking of sugar, it deserves a reckoning all of its own. You think of sugar as the harmless white stuff you're supposed to feel guilty about. In Tudor England, it's closer to a luxury drug and a doctor's prescription rolled into one. It arrives from far away at outrageous prices, so having any of it at all is a flex. Physicians cheerfully recommend it as medicine, prescribing sugary concoctions for all sorts of ailments, which is a bit like your dentist handing you a bag of fudge and calling it treatment. The wealthy eat so much of it that, as we mentioned, their teeth turn a fashionable shade of black, a look some people actually fake in order to seem rich. Trace where sugar comes from and its price makes sense. It's grown far away and shipped an enormous distance to reach an English pantry, which turns a bag of it into something close to treasure. For much of the century it's sold in small precious quantities, often through apothecaries rather than grocers, filed mentally somewhere between a spice, a medicine, and a jewel. To sweeten your food with real sugar rather than honey is to announce, loudly and deliciously, that you have money to burn. The medical angle is where it gets genuinely funny to modern ears. Tudor physicians, working from centuries of inherited theory, considered sugar warm and healthful, useful for balancing the body and soothing all manner of complaints. So they prescribed it with total confidence. Sugar found its way into cough remedies, tonics, and syrups, into medicinal sweets meant to settle the stomach or ease the chest, and into lozenges you'd swear were just candy. The idea that sugar might be the cause of illness rather than the cure would have struck a Tudor doctor as bizarre. To him, a spoonful of sugar didn't just help the medicine go down, it frequently was the medicine. This medical blessing gave the rich a marvellous excuse to gorge, and gorge they did. After a grand meal came the banquet, which in Tudor terms didn't mean the whole feast, but a specific final course of sweet delights. Candied fruits, spiced comfits, marzipan shapes, sugared nuts, and delicate sweetmeats, sometimes enjoyed in a special little banqueting house, built purely for the purpose of eating sugar in style. Imagine constructing an entire garden pavilion so you could nibble fancy candy away from the common folk. That is peak Tudor status, and it is glorious. The consequences showed up right in their mouths, as we've already seen. All that fashionable sugar rotted the teeth of the wealthy into a glossy black, so thoroughly that black teeth themselves became a sign of the good life, and social climbers reportedly darkened their own teeth to fake the look of someone who could afford the habit. It's a perfect little loop of vanity. Eat the expensive thing, ruin yourself with it, then have others copy the ruin because it signals the expense. Wellness culture has genuinely not moved on as far as it likes to think. The poor, meanwhile, stayed sweet the old-fashioned way. Honey did the work sugar did for the rich, gathered from hives and used to sweeten and preserve, along with the natural sugars of fruit dried or cooked down. It was cheaper, local, and it left their teeth in far better shape. though they'd have traded that dental advantage for a taste of the good stuff in a heartbeat. So sugar in Tudor England is not a guilty little snack. It's imported wealth, prescribed medicine, competitive dessert and dental catastrophe, all in one gleaming white crystal. Respect it. And since we've been talking about what these people put into their bodies, let's pour a drink, because the biggest myth of all is floating right there in the cup. You've heard it 100 times. Nobody drank water back then because it was basically liquid death. So everyone, babies included, stayed gently sloshed on beer from dawn onward. It's a great story for anyone who enjoys a lunchtime pint. It's also badly overcooked. Tudor people drank plenty of water, especially from wells and springs they trusted, and they knew perfectly well that some sources were clean and some were foul. Ale and small beer were popular because they were nutritious, tasty and safer than a scummy town ditch, not because a cup of spring water was a suicide pact. Let's kill the fun version first. If Tudor England were genuinely drunk from sunrise to sunset, nothing would ever have gotten done, and quite a lot got done, from farming to building to running a household on a knife-edge budget. The everyday drink for most people was small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew that quenched thirst and gave a little nourishment, without turning the entire nation into a stumbling mess. Yes, children drank it, but it was closer to a mild, bready refreshment than a pint of anything that would trouble a modern breathalyzer. Getting through the day required a clear enough head to avoid losing a hand in the harvest. Now the water itself. Tudor people were not idiots. They could see, smell and taste the difference between a clear spring and a stagnant, filthy ditch, and they drank accordingly. Fresh water from a trusted well, a bubbling spring, or a clean upland stream was drunk without a second thought, used in cooking, and valued precisely because good water was worth having. What they avoided sensibly was the obviously vile stuff, the sluggish urban water fouled by waste and industry, which really could kill you. That's not a blanket fear of all water. That's the basic common sense you'd share. So why brew so enthusiastically? Because ale and small beer were genuinely good things to have, not desperate substitutes. Brewing boiled the water, which happened to make it safer, though nobody understood the germ-killing reason behind it. The grain added real calories and nutrition, valuable fuel for people doing hard physical labour. It kept better than milk, tasted good, and could be made at home. Brewing was often women's work, and the alewife selling her latest batch was a fixture of village life, running what amounted to a small home business out of her own kitchen. The wealthy, naturally, had grander options. Wine, mostly imported and therefore expensive, was the drink of status at a rich table, poured to impress in exactly the way a good bottle still is today. Stronger ales and specially brewed beers appeared at feasts. But even the rich drank water and small beer in ordinary life, because you cannot function while permanently marinated in wine, and they had estates to run and rivals to outmaneuver. The kernel of truth, as always, is real. Urban water could indeed be dangerous. Waterborne illness was a genuine killer, and a weak beer was often the smarter, safer bet in a crowded, dirty town. The Tudors had good reasons to love their ale, but loving ale is not the same as believing water was poison. They drank both, chose sensibly between sources, and would find the idea that they never touched water frankly baffling. So sip your small beer if you like, but you're allowed a cup of clean well water too. Nobody here is going to stop you or call it a death wish. And speaking of ideas the Tudors are wrongly accused of holding, few are more insulting than the claim that they were all terrified of sailing straight off the edge of a flat world. Or so the myth would have you think. You imagine standing among a crowd of terrified Tudors who believe that if you sail far enough, you'll simply topple off the edge of the world into the mouth of a waiting sea monster. Lovely image, completely wrong. Educated people had known the Earth was a sphere for well over 1,000 years, and Tudor sailors, scholars and mapmakers absolutely knew it too. This was the age of ambitious ocean voyages, of men staking their lives and fortunes on the very roundness the myth claims they denied. The flat Earth panic is a much later invention, a story told to make our ancestors look like gullible children. They had many strange beliefs. That particular one was not among them. Let's give credit where it's centuries overdue. The ancient Greeks not only knew the Earth was round, one of them measured its circumference with shocking accuracy, using nothing but shadows, a stick, and a frankly infuriating amount of cleverness, and he did it more than 2,000 years before anyone worried about a Tudor. That knowledge never vanished. It was taught in the monasteries, argued over in the medieval universities, and written into the standard textbooks that educated Tudors grew up on. The round Earth was not a daring new theory. It was old, settled, boring fact. Look at what's in front of you, and it's obvious anyway. Stand on the shore, as any Tudor sailor did constantly, and watch a ship sail away. It doesn't shrink to a dot on a flat plane. The hull vanishes first, then the sails, then the very top of the mast, as if the vessel is sinking behind a curve, because it is. Watch the shadow the Earth throws across the moon during an eclipse. It's round, every single time. These people had eyes, and unlike you, they actually used them to look at the sky instead of at a phone. Then there's the small matter of the royal orb, that golden ball topped with a cross that monarchs clutched at their coronations. It represents the world. It is pointedly a sphere. Kings and queens were literally holding a little round Earth in their hands as a symbol of everything they ruled. If everyone believed the planet was a dinner plate, that would be an extremely confusing choice of prop. So where did the flat Earth slander come from? Mostly from writers hundreds of years later, who wanted to feel clever and modern by inventing a stupid, superstitious past. The famous tale that brave Christopher Columbus had to convince a room of terrified flat earthers the world was round before he set sail is almost entirely fiction, cooked up by a novelist long after the fact. The real argument in Columbus's day was never about the shape of the Earth. Everyone educated agreed it was a sphere. The argument was about how big that sphere was, and, awkwardly for him, his critics were closer to right than he was. He simply got lucky that an entire pair of continents happened to be in the way. The delicious irony is that the committed flat earther is a far more modern creature than the Tudor. Today, with satellites overhead and photographs of the whole blue marble a thumb swipe away, there are people who have talked themselves right back into the flat earth. Your ancestors, armed with sticks and shadows and their own two eyes, were quietly ahead of them. They understood the ground beneath their feet far better than the myth admits. Their beliefs about the body standing on top of that ground, however, are where things get properly weird. You wake up feeling rough and immediately assume any Tudor doctor will simply wave a chicken at you and recommend prayer. There was plenty of that, to be fair, along with a firm belief in balancing the four humours that we now know is complete fiction. But it's lazy to laugh at all of it. Tudor healers used willow bark, which contains the active ingredient behind aspirin. They packed honey onto wounds, which we now know genuinely fights infection. They knew certain herbs eased pain, calmed stomachs, and helped people sleep. Buried in among the leeches and the guesswork were real, hard-won scraps of knowledge, passed down by people paying very close attention. Start with the framework, because it's genuinely fascinating and how wrong it was. Tudor medicine ran on the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, they believed, meant keeping these four in perfect balance, and illness meant one had gotten out of hand, feverish and flushed. too much blood, obviously, so out comes the blade or the leech to drain a little off. It's a tidy, logical, and completely fictional system, and doctors applied it with total confidence to absolutely everything, which is where the bloodletting horror stories come from. But here is where the sneering stops being fair. Alongside the nonsense sat centuries of patient, careful observation. Tudor healers used willow bark to bring down fevers and ease aches, and willow bark contains salicin, the natural ancestor of the aspirin in your bathroom cabinet. They slathered honey on wounds, and honey genuinely kills bacteria, so reliably that modern hospitals still use medical-grade honey on stubborn infections. That is not a lucky guess. That is real medicine, arrived at the hard way. The herbal knowledge went deep. They reached for chamomile and valerian to help the restless sleep, mint and fennel to settle a churning stomach, garlic for its genuine antibacterial punch, and a whole shelf of plants whose effects had been catalogued through generations of trial, error, and funerals. Much of this wisdom lived with women, the wise women and cunning folk and midwives who were often the first, cheapest, and most effective help a sick villager could find. Bone setters could reset a broken limb with a skill that would earn a nod from a modern doctor, none of which means you should cancel your health insurance and move here. The genuine horrors were real and constant. There was no anesthesia beyond getting the patient drunk or knocking them out with pain. There was no notion of germs, so the same unwashed knife moved cheerfully from patient to patient. Surgery was a scream-filled gamble. Infection killed casually, and if the herbs failed, the fallback was more bloodletting, a purge, and a priest edging toward the bed. Astrology was consulted for diagnosis with the same seriousness as the pulse, so the honest picture is a genuine tangle. Tudor medicine was part hard-won folk wisdom that actually worked, part elaborate theoretical fantasy that actively harmed people, all bundled together with no reliable way to tell which was which. The willow bark sat right next to the leech, and the same healer trusted both completely. It was not the pure ignorant superstition the myth insists on, but it was not somewhere you'd want to be treated either, and nothing haunts our image of old-timey disease quite like a certain beaked mask. You picture the plague and your mind instantly conjures that iconic figure. The long black robe, the wide hat, and the sinister bird mask with its curved beak, stuffed full of herbs. Here's the quiet problem. That costume didn't exist yet. It was dreamed up well over half a century after the last Tudor monarch died, by a French physician in the 1600s. Tudor plague was terrifying, real, and horribly frequent, but the people fighting it did not swan about dressed as melancholy crows. They wore ordinary clothes, fled when they could, and boarded up infected houses with heartbreaking desperation. Let's pin down the timeline, because it's the whole case. The Tudor era ends right at the dawn of the 1600s. The beaked plague costume, with its herb-stuffed snout and waxed robe, was designed by a French doctor a good while after that, deep into the following century. So every image you've ever seen of a beaked figure creeping through Tudor London is an anachronism, roughly as accurate as putting a Tudor merchant in sunglasses. The mask is real. It's just wearing the wrong century. The costume's logic, when it did arrive, came from the theory of the day, that disease travelled on bad air, a foul-smelling miasma. The beak was packed with aromatic herbs and flowers, so the doctor could breathe sweet-smelling air and supposedly filter out the poison. It was wrong about the cause, since plague actually spread through fleas and the animals that carried them, but you can at least admire the grim commitment to the theme. So what did a Tudor actually see when plague swept the town, which it did again and again across the century? Far less theatrical, far more frightening. When someone fell ill, the house was often sealed shut with the healthy family trapped inside alongside the sick, a painted mark daubed on the door to warn everyone away, and a watchman posted to make sure nobody slipped out. Imagine being locked in your own home with a dying relative and a red mark on the door, listening to the watchman shuffle outside. That was the real horror, and it came with no dramatic costume at all. The town appointed searchers, usually poor old women, paid a pittance to inspect the bodies and report what had killed them, feeding the grim tally of the death lists. People burned fires in the streets and carried little pomanders and bunches of herbs pressed to their noses, working from the same bad air theory that would later inspire the beak. And anyone with money and sense did the most effective thing available. They ran. The wealthy fled the cities for the countryside at the first sign of an outbreak, leaving the poor behind to face it, which tells you everything about who bore the worst of it. It's worth remembering the Tudors also had their own uniquely terrifying disease that wasn't the plague at all, a violent illness that could strike a healthy person in the morning and kill them by nightfall, sweeping through in sudden, baffling waves. Between that and the recurring plague, death by epidemic was a constant, ordinary companion, not a rare Gothic event. So the plague was every bit as real and dreadful as you imagine. The people facing it were simply dressed like ordinary, frightened human beings, not like the theatrical bird doctor your brain keeps casting in the role. That costume belongs to a later, gloomier century entirely. And while we're on the subject of plague myths you absorbed as a child, let's talk about a nursery rhyme. You've known this one since primary school and repeated it with grim satisfaction ever since. The innocent little rhyme, everyone insists, is actually a coded description of the plague. The rosy rash, the posies of herbs, the sneezing, and then everyone falling down dead. It's a wonderfully creepy theory. It's also almost certainly made up. Folklorists point out that the rhyme doesn't appear in writing until the 1800s, centuries too late, and that its earliest versions don't even match the tidy plague story people love to tell. Line up the dates, and the whole theory starts sweating. If the rhyme were a coded record of a Tudor or medieval plague, you'd expect it to turn up somewhere in the written record close to those events. It doesn't. The first printed versions surface only in the 1800s, hundreds of years after the outbreaks it supposedly describes. That's an awfully long game of telephone for a secret code to survive intact while leaving no trace along the way. Rhymes that old usually leave footprints. This one appears suddenly, late, and looking suspiciously innocent. Worse for the legend, the early versions don't say what the story needs them to say. The word shifted from region to region, and book to book. Some had no sneezing at all. Some ended not with everyone dropping dead, but with them all standing back up, or with the children simply crouching down and springing up again as part of the game. The neat, ghoulish reading only works if you cherry-pick the one modern version that happens to fit and quietly ignore all the others that don't. Then there's the interpretation itself, which falls apart the moment you poke it. The rosy rash, we're told, was a plague symptom. The posies were herbs carried to ward off the smell of death. The ashes represented cremation, and the falling down was, of course, dying. But plague victims weren't cremated. They were buried, often hastily and in great numbers, so the cremation reading is simply wrong, and some versions don't even feature ashes, using a plain sneezing sound instead. The tidy code only looks tidy because someone worked backward from a spooky conclusion and forced the pieces to fit. So where did the plague theory actually come from? Not from the Tudors, and not from any medieval survivor whispering a warning to the future. It seems to have been invented in the 20th century by people who found the idea irresistible, and then it spread like a plague, because a grim hidden meaning is far more fun to repeat than a boring nursery rhyme about children dancing in a circle. It's a perfect little case study in how a good, creepy story outruns a dull truth every single time. Which, if you think about it, is the exact theme of this entire episode. You have spent your whole life confidently repeating a spooky fact that a teacher once told you, that a documentary once implied, that your own memory has since polished into certainty. and it simply isn't true. The rhyme is almost certainly just a children's game with the usual nonsense words that children's games always have, retrofitted centuries later with a morbid backstory it never asked for, so you can stop feeling clever every time you sing it at a birthday party. The circle of children falling down is not a coded scream from the mass graves. It's just kids being kids, then and now. Now let's tackle a lie about how young people supposedly married. You assume that in Tudor England a girl was basically married off the second she stopped playing with dolls, betrothed at 12 and a mother by 14. For most ordinary people this is simply false. The average commoner didn't marry until their mid-20s, once they'd actually saved a little, learned a trade, and could vaguely afford a household. It was the noble and royal families, obsessed with alliances and bloodlines, who occasionally shackled children together for political reasons, and even then the marriage often waited years to become real. Here's the reality the myth ignores completely. For the vast majority of Tudor people, the ordinary farmers, labourers, servants, and craftsmen who made up nearly the whole population, marriage was something that happened in your mid-20s, not your childhood. Women commonly married somewhere around their mid-20s, men a little later. That's not a fringe exception. That was the normal expected pattern for most of the country, and it lasted for generations. The reason is boringly practical, which is exactly why it's true. You could not simply marry on a whim at 14 because you had nothing. Setting up a household needed money, tools, a place to live, and the skills to run it, and getting those took years. Young people spent their teens and early 20s working as servants in other people's houses or learning a trade as apprentices, slowly saving and gaining the experience to stand on their own. Only once you could actually support a family did marriage make sense. It's the 16th century version of that very modern sigh about how you can't possibly afford to settle down until the finances are in order. So the streets were full of unmarried young adults, working, saving, and quietly getting on with their 20s, which would look completely familiar to you. Some people married later still. Some never married at all, staying single their whole lives as servants or workers, which was common and unremarkable. The idea that every girl was a wife by 15 would have puzzled an ordinary Tudor, who could look around at all the perfectly normal unmarried 20-somethings and wonder what on earth you were talking about. Where does the child bride image come from then? From the top, as usual, because the powerful behave differently and the powerful are who the history books remember. Noble and royal families sometimes did arrange marriages for children, occasionally very young ones. But these were political mergers, treaties dressed up as weddings, designed to lock in alliances, land and bloodlines. A child duke might be formally betrothed or even married to a child from another great family to seal a deal between dynasties, and even then, crucially, these child marriages were often not real marriages in any full sense for years. A very young couple would typically be kept apart, living separately, and the marriage would only truly begin once they were older. The wedding was the contract. Actual married life waited. So even at the top, the picture of a 12-year-old whisked straight into full married life is more exception and scandal than routine. It's a classic trick of history. The dramatic behaviour of a tiny wealthy elite gets mistaken for how everyone lived, because the elite are the ones who left grand records, portraits and gossip behind. The quiet, sensible masses, marrying in their 20s after years of saving, left far fewer traces, and so vanished from the story. So no, you have not woken up in a world of child brides. You've woken up in a world of prudent late 20s marriages that would make a modern financial planner nod in approval. Which leads us neatly to another group the history books love to underestimate: women. You've been told that a Tudor woman was little more than furniture in a bonnet, silent, powerless, and owned outright by whichever man happened to be standing nearby. the full picture is far more interesting. Yes, the law was heavily stacked against them, and yes, life was harder for them in 100 exhausting ways. But women ran households that were essentially small businesses, brewed and sold ale, managed farms, worked as midwives and healers, joined guilds, ran shops as widows, and wielded enormous quiet influence over money, marriage, and reputation. And presiding over the entire country for much of the era were two queens ruling in their own right. Let's not sugarcoat the law, because it was genuinely brutal. Under the rules of the day, a married woman's property and legal identity were largely swallowed up by her husband. What she owned, he controlled. She couldn't easily sign contracts or go to court in her own name. On paper, a wife was close to invisible. The myth starts from a real and infuriating place, and no honest account should pretend otherwise. But paper is not the same as daily life, and daily life told a richer story. A Tudor household was not a place where the woman sat decoratively while the man did everything important. It was a working economic unit, and she ran it. She managed the money, the food, the servants if there were any, the brewing, the baking, the garden, the animals, and the endless labour that kept a family alive. A capable wife was a business partner running half of a joint enterprise, and everyone quietly knew it, whatever the law said. Plenty of women worked and earned in their own right too. Brewing ale was so often women's work that the alewife was a village institution, selling her batches and running a small trade from her kitchen. Women worked as spinners, dairy women, laundresses, seamstresses, market sellers, and servants. Midwives held real licensed authority over the crucial, dangerous business of childbirth, trusted with life and death in a way no man was allowed to intrude upon. And a widow, freed from her husband's legal shadow, could inherit and run his business or shop as a woman of independent means, sometimes becoming a formidable figure in her own town. At the very top, the era practically dares you to call women powerless. This was the century when England was ruled, for decades, by queens holding the throne in their own right, not as somebody's decorative wife, but as the actual monarch, commanding armies, dodging plots, and outmanoeuvring the cleverest men in Europe. There were also formidable noblewomen who built dynasties, amassed fortunes, raised great houses, and pulled strings across the whole kingdom through sheer will and cunning. And then there was the quiet, informal power the myth never counts. Influence over who married whom, control of household reputation, the vast social currency of gossip. In a world where your good name was everything, the women who managed that reputation, who knew everyone's business and shaped what the village believed, held a real and dangerous kind of power. Cross the wrong matriarch and you'd feel it. So the honest verdict is not powerless, it's constrained, hemmed in by cruel laws, and forced to exercise power sideways rather than openly. But invisible? Never. Tudor women worked, earned, managed, influenced, and in a few spectacular cases ruled the entire country. The furniture in a bonnet is a lazy insult to some genuinely tough, capable people. And speaking of things people wrongly assume, let's sort out who could actually read. You picture a whole nation of people who couldn't read a single word and signed their names with a shaky X, if that. Literacy was certainly limited, and if you were a poor rural woman, your odds were slim. But the picture was patchier and brighter than the myth suggests, and it was changing fast. Printing had arrived, cheap pamphlets and ballads were everywhere, and a surprising number of townsfolk, merchants and craftsmen could read at least a little, especially the men in the growing cities. Let's be honest about the flaw first. Full reading and writing were far from universal, and the divide was stark. If you were a poor woman scratching a living in a remote village, the odds you could read were genuinely low. Wealth, town life, sex and profession all tilted the scales. So a rich merchant in London and a landless labourer's wife in the far countryside lived in almost different worlds of literacy. The myth isn't wrong that many people couldn't read. It's wrong that nobody could. Because the era was, in fact, in the middle of a reading revolution. The printing press had arrived and cheap print was pouring out. Pamphlets, almanacs, ballads, religious tracts, and news sheets sold on the streets for pennies. Suddenly the written word wasn't locked away in a monastery. It was pinned to tavern walls and hawked at markets. When print becomes cheap and everywhere, more people learn to read it, because there's finally a reason to. The demand and the skill fed each other, and literacy climbed steadily through the century. There's a lovely quirk in how they learned too. Reading and writing were taught as separate skills, and reading came first. So there were plenty of people who could read a printed page perfectly well, but could not actually write much beyond their own name. That means signature-based head counts, where historians tally who could sign their name, probably undercount the readers, since a person who read comfortably might still make a clumsy mark instead of a signature. The reading public was likely bigger than the writing public, and bigger than the grim old statistics suggest. Schools were spreading as well. Grammar schools were founded and endowed across the country, offering a real education, mostly to boys, and turning out a growing class of literate men to staff the church, the law, trade, and administration. A bright boy of modest birth could, with luck and a benefactor, learn to read Latin and rise. It wasn't equal and it wasn't wide, but it was a genuine and growing ladder. Here's the clincher though. This was the century that produced an absolute tidal wave of poetry, plays, and printed stories. You do not get a golden age of writing without an audience hungry to consume it. The theatres were packed with ordinary people, and the bookstalls did brisk business. Which points to the final, crucial truth. You did not have to read to live in a world of words. Print was read aloud in homes and taverns, ballads were sung in the streets, sermons and proclamations were spoken to crowds. The illiterate still soaked up stories, news and ideas through their ears. It's much like the way plenty of people today devour audiobooks and podcasts without ever technically reading a page. So the nation of shaky X marks is a caricature. Literacy was uneven, tilted by class and sex and geography, but it was real. It was rising fast, and the written word reached even those who couldn't decode it themselves. And since we've mentioned all that poetry, let's clear up how these people actually spoke. You assume that if you open your mouth here, or worse, tried to read a playbill, it would all be baffling, ancient gibberish, full of impossible spellings and words nobody alive could pass. People love to call this Old English. It is not. Old English is the language of Beowulf, and it's genuinely unrecognisable to you. What the late Tudors spoke and wrote is early modern English, which is essentially your language wearing a very fancy hat. Read it aloud and you'll understand the vast majority of it. Let's sort out the labels, because people fling them around with total confidence and total inaccuracy. Old English is the ancient stuff, the language of a poem like Beowulf, and if you saw a page of it you would not recognise it as English at all. It looks like a foreign language with a few oddly familiar shapes, because it basically is one to a modern reader. Then there's Middle English, the language of Chaucer, which is a genuine struggle but sometimes squintable. What the late Tudors used is a third thing entirely, early modern English, and it is close enough to yours that you could argue with a Tudor about the weather without too much trouble. The proof is that you have almost certainly read it and understood it. The plays and poems of the era, once you get past the poetry itself, are written in words you know arranged in sentences you can follow. The famous speeches that get quoted at you are hard not because the language is alien, but because they're dense, clever poetry packed with jokes, insults, and references to a world you don't live in. That's a difficulty of wit and context, not of vocabulary. Strip away the fancy verse and the everyday speech underneath is remarkably plain. The bits that trip you up are cosmetic. Spelling wasn't standardized yet, so the same writer might spell the same word 3 different ways on one page, purely by mood. That looks chaotic, but read it out loud and it usually resolves into a word you know instantly. And then there are the famous thee and thou and thy, which everyone assumes are stiff, formal, old-timey words for addressing your betters. Here's the delicious twist. They were actually the casual, intimate forms, the words you used with family, close friends, children, and social inferiors. The polite, formal, respectful pronoun was, of all things, you. So the speech you think sounds fancy and archaic was frequently the opposite of fancy. It was cosy and familiar. The sound would have been different, mind you. The accent had shifted a great deal from earlier centuries and was still settling. So a Tudor would not sound like a modern film actor doing a posh voice. But the words themselves, the actual language, would be about 90% familiar to your ear, with the odd unfamiliar term you could puzzle out from context, exactly as you do when you read something written by your own great-grandparents. The writers of the age were also busy inventing and popularizing words at a furious rate, coining terms and phrases you still use daily without realizing where they came from. So far from being some crusty dead tongue, this was English in one of its most creative, explosive, and inventive moments, throwing out new words like sparks. You're not standing in a fog of gibberish. You're standing at a lively, familiar, slightly differently pronounced version of your own language, mid-growth spurt. So you could hold a conversation here, awkwardly, today. Now, about the darker corners of Tudor justice and the roaring bonfire the movies promised you. Your mental picture of a Tudor witch trial almost certainly ends with a screaming woman tied to a stake and swallowed by flames. If this were continental Europe, you might have a point. But in England, convicted witches were almost always hanged, not burned. Burning was reserved for the crimes of heresy and a nasty little category called petty treason, such as a wife murdering her husband. On top of that, the truly frenzied witch panics mostly came after the Tudor era, not during it. Let's separate the crimes because the confusion sits right there. In England, witchcraft, once it became a felony under the law, was punished the way other serious felonies were, by hanging. The condemned witch went to the gallows, not the pyre. Burning at the stake was a punishment English law kept for 2 specific and different offences. One was heresy, holding the wrong religious beliefs, which is a whole grim story of its own. The other was petty treason, the crime of killing someone you were bound to obey, such as a wife who murdered her husband or a servant who killed a master. Neither of those is witchcraft. The flaming stake and the accused witch belong to separate columns in the ledger. So where did the burning witch image come from? Partly from abroad. In parts of continental Europe and notably in Scotland just to the north, witches genuinely were burned, often in horrifying numbers. Those foreign and neighbouring horrors bled into the general imagination, got stirred together with England's own religious burnings, and eventually congealed into a single blurry picture of witch plus fire that films then cheerfully cemented. A director wants a dramatic blaze, not a quiet hanging. So the bonfire won the cultural memory even though English witches mostly swung. The timing is off in the popular story too. When you picture the great witch panics, the mass trials, the professional witch hunters roaming the countryside extracting confessions, you're mostly picturing events that came after the Tudor century had ended, in the more paranoid decades that followed. Tudor witchcraft accusations certainly existed once the laws against it were passed, but they were more scattered and local than the frenzy of later years, and often centred on very domestic grievances. A neighbour blamed for a dead cow, a curdled batch of butter, a sickly child, a run of bad luck pinned on the odd woman down the lane. That's the sad, mundane heart of most real accusations. This wasn't usually high Gothic drama with cackling and broomsticks. It was neighbours turning on neighbours, often targeting poor, old, isolated women who had annoyed someone or simply become inconvenient. A sharp tongue, a reputation for cursing, some herbal knowledge, or just being the strange old woman at the edge of the village could be enough to get you blamed when misfortune struck. It was a moral panic that fed on grudges, fear, and the human need to find someone to blame for random cruelty, which if you've watched any modern pile-on feels grimly familiar. So the horror was real, and innocent people did die for an imaginary crime, but get the details right. In Tudor England, the witch was hanged, not burned. The flames were mostly reserved for other charges entirely, and the truly frenzied hunts were largely a later chapter. The screaming pyre is a foreign import wearing an English costume, and no accused woman in Tudor history is more myth-wrapped than one particular queen. You've heard the whispers that the doomed queen had a sixth finger, extra nipples, warts, and a secret talent for witchcraft that supposedly bewitched a king into ruin. It's deliciously creepy and almost entirely propaganda. These lurid details appear mainly in a hostile account written decades after her death, by a man with every reason to smear her. Contemporaries who actually laid eyes on her described a striking, elegant, sharp-witted woman, not a many-fingered sorceress. Track the sixth finger to its source and the whole thing wobbles. The vivid catalogue of deformities, the extra finger, the strange growths, the marks of the devil, comes overwhelmingly from a book written by a hostile religious writer almost 50 years after Anne was already dead. This was a man with a fierce agenda, out to blacken her name, delegitimize everything she stood for, and by extension smear her daughter, who by then sat on the throne. He was not a witness. He was a propagandist working long after the fact, and he had every motive to invent a monster. Now set that beside the people who were actually there, diplomats and courtiers who met Anne in the flesh, including sharp-eyed foreign ambassadors whose entire job was to notice and report every detail, described her quite differently. She was not, by the fashion of the day, a conventional beauty, and some frankly said so. But they described a woman who was elegant, stylish, magnetic, with dark, expressive eyes, a quick wit, and a way of commanding a room. What they conspicuously did not mention was a sixth finger. You would think that a queen with an extra digit might have rated a line or two in somebody's careful notes. Nobody who saw her seems to have noticed the one detail everybody now repeats. Think about it practically for a moment. This was a court obsessed with appearance, bloodline, and any hint of physical imperfection, where a visible deformity could be read as a sign of inner corruption or divine disfavour. A genuine sixth finger on the Queen would have been the gossip of Europe, seized upon by her many enemies the instant she rose to prominence, not conveniently discovered decades after her execution by a man who never met her. The silence of everyone who actually knew her is deafening. The witchcraft angle is just as flimsy. When Anne was destroyed, the formal charges against her were adultery, incest, and treason. A grim enough list assembled to justify getting rid of her. Witchcraft was not among the official accusations. The notion that she was a literal sorceress who enchanted the king comes from that same later hostile myth-making, the kind of thing that gets said about any powerful, disliked woman who ends up on the wrong side of history. Call her a witch, and you turn a political murder into a righteous exorcism, because that's what this really is, a smear campaign that outlived everyone involved. Anne was a genuinely formidable woman, clever, ambitious, and politically bold, who climbed astonishingly high and was then torn down by a king who wanted out and enemies who wanted her gone. Rather than simply admit that a queen had been judicially destroyed for convenience, later storytellers found it far more satisfying to remake her as a deformed, devilish seductress who had it coming. It's the 16th century version of a character assassination that snowballs online, where the lurid version always travels further than the truth. So, no. History did not record her sixth finger. It invented one, long after she could defend herself, and her former husband has suffered a very different distortion of his own. You picture Henry VIII and you see the famous portrait, enormous, glowering, planted like a meat cabinet in a doorway, a turkey leg practically implied. That was the ending, not the whole story. The young Henry was tall, athletic, and genuinely dazzling, a jousting, hunting, music writing, dancing golden boy that foreign visitors gushed over in their letters home. The mountainous, ulcer-ridden tyrant came later, after a brutal jousting accident, years of rich food and a slow slide into paranoia and pain. Reducing him to the fat portrait is like judging a whole person by their single, most difficult decade. Rewind to the beginning and you find a completely different man. Henry came to the throne as a teenager, barely 17, arriving like a burst of sunlight after his cautious, penny-pinching father. Tall, broad, red gold, and glowing with health, he towered over almost everyone around him. Foreign ambassadors, professionally cynical men paid to spot weaknesses, instead sent home letters practically swooning, calling him the handsomest and most accomplished prince they had ever seen. He was the celebrity heartthrob of European royalty, and he knew it. He had the substance to match the shine too, at least in his youth. He jousted with real skill and reckless courage, wrestled, hunted from dawn until his horses gave out, and played tennis with a ferocity that left courtiers wheezing. He was a genuine athlete in an age that worshipped it. He was also, annoyingly for anyone hoping to dislike him, clever. He spoke several languages, argued theology, read widely, and even wrote a book defending the church that earned him a grand title from the Pope, which would become spectacularly ironic later on. And he was seriously musical, playing several instruments and composing real pieces performed at his glittering court. Picture the whole package. A young giant who could outride you, out-argue you, then sit down and perform a song he'd written himself. It's genuinely obnoxious. So what happened? Life happened, slowly, and then all at once. The turning point came in his mid-40s, when a catastrophic jousting accident left him crushed beneath his own armoured horse. The wound to his leg never truly healed. It festered into a chronic, agonising ulcer that plagued him for the rest of his days, weeping and refusing to close. The athlete could no longer exercise, but the appetite of an athlete stayed right where it was. He kept eating like a man still burning it off in the tilt yard, while barely able to walk. The result is the figure you know. The lean giant swelled into a mountainous man, his armour eventually let out to a waist well over 50 inches, hauled between rooms in special chairs, in more or less constant pain. And pain, over years, does terrible things to a person. The charming, confident prince curdled into a suspicious, volatile, ruthless king, quick to see betrayal and quicker to sign a death warrant. The wives, the executions, the terror hanging over his later reign all belong to this second, broken version of the man. And that is the version the famous portrait froze forever. The vast stance, the tiny angry eyes, the jewels straining across an enormous chest. It's a stunning image, and it has completely devoured the memory of the golden boy who came first. Judging him by that portrait alone is like judging anyone by their single worst, most painful decade and pretending the bright years never existed. And one of the most charming lies about him involves a song. It's such a romantic story that you almost want it to be true. The lovesick king, aching for the woman who keeps refusing him, pours his whole heart into a haunting melody that still drifts out of music boxes today. Sadly, it's a myth with nothing behind it. The musical style of the tune points to a period well after Henry was safely tucked in his tomb, and nobody in his own lifetime ever credited him with it. Henry genuinely was a capable musician who composed real pieces, which is probably how the legend latched on so easily. But that particular tearjerker was not his gift to Anne. You can see exactly why the story stuck, because it's almost too perfect. Take the most famous king in English history, add the most famous doomed romance in English history, and attach them to one of the most recognisable old tunes anyone can hum. It practically writes itself. A tale that neat and that emotionally satisfying doesn't need evidence to spread. It just needs to be repeated by enough people who never thought to check, which describes the entire history of the human race. The trouble is, the music itself gives the game away. The particular style the melody is built on, its structure and the fashionable technique underpinning it, points to a musical trend that arrived in England after Henry was already dead and buried. In other words, the tune belongs to a later generation's taste. Asking Henry to have written it is a bit like insisting your grandfather composed a song that only became possible years after he passed away. The timeline simply refuses to cooperate, and the earlier solid record of the song appears decades after Henry's death. What makes the myth so sticky is that the raw ingredient is real. Henry genuinely was a gifted and enthusiastic musician. He played, he sang, and he composed actual pieces that survive to this day. Cheerful, courtly songs and sacred works that were performed for his entertainment. He was proud of it, and his court was a hive of music. So when people went looking for someone to pin a beloved old tune on, a real musician king was the obvious, flattering candidate. The legend didn't come from nowhere. It came from a true fact bent into a false one. This is one of the oldest tricks in the human storybook, and you fall for the modern version of it constantly. Think of all the wise, punchy quotations confidently attributed to famous clever people, the ones plastered under sunset photographs online, that those people demonstrably never said. We love to hand our favourite words and works to our favourite faces, because a quote or a song feels weightier when a legend is attached. Anonymous is boring. Famous is memorable. So the anonymous gets quietly adopted by the famous, and the truth loses the race. None of which takes anything away from the tune, which is genuinely gorgeous, or from Henry, who really could write music worth hearing. It just means this specific, tragic, candlelit image of a heartsick king pouring his longing for Anne into that melody is a lovely fiction. He did not sit up composing it by the light of his obsession. Someone generations later decided he should have, and history quietly nodded along. It's a beautiful story that the evidence politely declines to confirm. From doomed romance, let's stumble sideways into the reign of the Queen everyone underestimates. You might imagine the first Elizabeth as a pale, powdered ornament, propped up on a throne while clever men did all the actual ruling around her. That notion would have amused her, and then infuriated her. Elizabeth was one of the shrewdest political operators of the entire century, a ruler who survived decades of plots, played rival powers against one another with icy patience, dangled her own marriage as a diplomatic weapon for years, and held a fractious kingdom together largely through sheer force of will and calculated performance. She wasn't managed, she did the managing. Look at the mess she inherited and the achievement gets clearer. She came to the throne of a country that was broke, bitterly divided over religion, threatened by far larger foreign powers, and thoroughly convinced that a young unmarried woman could not possibly govern it. Most people expected her to fail fast, marry quickly, and hand the real power to a husband. Instead, she ruled in her own right for over 4 decades and left the country stronger, richer, and more confident than she found it. That is not what figureheads do. Her masterstroke was refusing to marry and turning that refusal into a weapon. Every unmarried year she kept a parade of foreign princes and domestic nobles hopeful, dangling the prize of her hand as a diplomatic tool. A rival kingdom might stay friendly for years simply because its prince still fancied his chances. She strung along suitors, extracted advantages, and committed to none of them, keeping her independence and her leverage intact the entire time. It was a decades-long negotiation in which she held all the cards and never once had to show her hand. She was surrounded by formidable, ambitious men, a sharp chief minister, a ruthless spy master, powerful nobles all jostling for influence, and the lazy version of the story says they ran things while she smiled and waved. The truth is she chose them, used them, played them against each other, and kept ultimate decisions firmly in her own grip. They spent their careers trying to anticipate a mind that consistently stayed 3 moves ahead of them. She let them argue, then decided, and everyone knew whose word was final. She survived a genuinely terrifying gauntlet of plots and rival claims, threats to her life and her crown that would have toppled a weaker ruler. She navigated the deadly religious tensions of the age by steering a careful middle course, avoiding the worst of the bloodshed that consumed neighbouring lands. And when a vast foreign fleet came to invade, she turned even that terror into theatre, appearing before her gathered troops to rally them in a performance so stirring it echoed for centuries. Whether the danger was past or not, she understood that looking fearless was half the battle, because that was her real genius. She grasped that monarchy was performance, and she was a master of it. The jewels, the dazzling gowns, the carefully cultivated image of an ageless, untouchable queen, married only to her country, all of it was deliberate stagecraft designed to inspire loyalty and awe. She built her own legend on purpose and then lived inside it. That is not the behaviour of an ornament. That is a ruler who understood power at a level the men around her only dreamed of. So figurehead is the last word anyone who actually dealt with her would reach for. She was the sharpest player at the table, in a century full of sharp players. And speaking of things wrongly reduced to a single grim purpose, consider the Tower. You hear Tower of London, and your brain files it instantly under torture, beheadings, and ravens quietly plotting your doom. It certainly did its share of grim work, but treating it as merely a prison is like calling your entire house the room where the boiler lives. The Tower was a royal palace where monarchs actually stayed, a fortress, the national mint stamping out the country's coins, an armoury, the storehouse for the crown jewels, and wonderfully a royal zoo where lions, leopards, and even a great pale bear were once kept over the centuries. Executions were the exception, not the daily timetable. Start with its grandest role, the one nobody remembers. The Tower was a royal palace, complete with royal apartments where monarchs actually lodged, most notably in the days before a coronation, when a new king or queen would traditionally stay there in splendour before processing through the city to be crowned. So the same walls the myth paints as pure misery also hosted the glittering eve of the greatest celebration in a monarch's life, grim dungeon and gilded palace in the same complex. Then there's the money, quite literally. For centuries, the tower housed the royal mint, the beating financial heart of the kingdom, where the nation's coins were struck, hammered out from glowing metal by skilled workers labouring in its workshops. Every coin jingling in a Tudor purse likely began its life inside these walls. The place wasn't just guarding the realm, it was manufacturing its cash. It was also the country's great armoury and arsenal, packed with weapons and armour, and the secure storehouse for the crown jewels and precious royal records. In an age with no banks as you'd know them, where do you keep the most valuable objects in the entire kingdom? Behind the thickest walls, the deepest moat, and the most guards you can muster. The tower was the national safe deposit box, the vault where a nervous monarchy stashed everything it could not bear to lose. And then, gloriously, there was the zoo. For a very long stretch, the tower was home to the royal menagerie, a collection of exotic beasts, lions, leopards, and other strange animals sent as extravagant diplomatic gifts by foreign rulers, kept and displayed as a symbol of royal magnificence. Over the centuries, the collection even numbered a great pale bear, famously allowed on a long chain to fish in the river beside the fortress. Imagine strolling up to this supposed house of pure horror and being greeted by the roar of lions and a bear angling for its lunch. It was a tourist attraction as much as a terror. Yes, it held prisoners, and yes, some very famous heads rolled within or near its walls, which is precisely why that single function swallowed the memory of all the others. High-profile executions make for gripping stories, and gripping stories crowd out the boring truth. But those dramatic days were rare punctuation marks. On the vast majority of ordinary mornings, the tower hummed along as a busy, multi-purpose hub of government, its people minting coins, guarding treasure, cataloguing armour, and feeding the lions with not a beheading in sight. So picture it properly. Not a grim single-use house of pain, but a chaotic government mega-complex, a palace and a fortress, and a bank vault and an armoury and a zoo, all crammed together behind one set of famous walls. It did far more living than dying. Now let's gently reconsider a queen with a deeply unfair nickname. You know her mainly by the cocktail and the nickname, and you assume Mary I was a cackling sadist who burned people for sport. She did have close to 300 people put to death by burning for their religious beliefs, which is a genuine horror and not to be waved away. But the cartoon of a singularly monstrous queen leaves out the context. She was following a brutal European pattern of the era. Her religious opponents did the same when the tables were turned, and that memorable nickname was hammered into legend by the very people who won the propaganda war after her death. Let's be clear and honest first, because the suffering was real and terrible. Under her rule, hundreds of people were condemned and burned for holding the wrong religious beliefs, and their deaths were agonizing and unjust. Nothing that follows is meant to soften that or explain it away. Those people were human beings who died horribly for their faith, and they deserve to be remembered with sorrow. The point is not to excuse what happened, but to understand why she alone became the century's byword for cruelty when she was far from the only ruler of her age to do such things. Because that is the uncomfortable context the nickname erases. Executing people for their religion was, tragically, close to standard practice across much of Europe in this period. Rulers of every faction did it, convinced they were protecting the true faith and the souls of their people. The reverse of Mary's persecution was also true. Those on the other side of the religious divide executed their opponents too before her reign and after it, often by methods every bit as brutal. Cruelty in the name of religion was a shared sickness of the age, not the invention of one wicked queen. So why did she, specifically, become Bloody Mary, while others escaped with cleaner reputations? Largely because she lost the long game of memory. After her death, the throne passed to the other side of the religious divide, and it was that side who wrote the histories, printed the influential books, and shaped how she would be remembered for centuries. A hugely popular account of the martyrs who died under her, published once her opponents held power, seared her cruelty into the national imagination while quietly framing everything through the eyes of the winners. History's nicknames are handed out by whoever holds the pen afterward, and hers was written by her enemies. There is also the person underneath the legend, who was far more tragic than monstrous. She was frequently unwell, worn down by illness and by the crushing, personal disappointments of a body that failed her hopes again and again. Her husband, a foreign prince, spent much of the marriage far away, leaving her isolated. She was politically cornered, clinging to a religious restoration she sincerely believed would save the souls of her people. She was not a villain relishing her power. She was a lonely, sick, deeply serious woman who believed she was doing something righteous, which is in many ways a sadder and more human story than the cackling caricature. None of this turns the suffering into anything other than what it was, but it does dismantle the idea of a uniquely evil monster standing apart from her time. She was a product of a cruel and frightened age, doing cruel things that many of her contemporaries also did, remembered more harshly than the rest because the losing side rarely gets to write its own story. History rarely hands out its nicknames fairly, and few figures ever collected more undeserved credit than our next Tudor celebrity. You probably absorbed two neat little facts about Sir Walter Raleigh: that he gallantly flung his cloak over a puddle so the Queen wouldn't muddy her shoes, and that he personally introduced both the potato and tobacco to England. Charming, mostly untrue. The cloak and puddle story surfaces only long after his death, invented by a writer who liked a good scene. The potato reached Europe through Spanish explorers, not out of Raleigh's pocket, and tobacco was already trickling in through other hands entirely. Take the cloak first, because it's the most beloved and the most obviously invented. There is no contemporary record of it. Nobody who actually lived alongside Raleigh mentions this gallant little moment. The tale appears for the first time more than a century later, in the pages of a writer with a well-known fondness for a charming anecdote and a loose relationship with strict fact. In other words, it was a nice story someone made up long after everyone involved was safely dead and unable to say, "Hang on, that never happened." It endured because it's the perfect image of chivalry, not because it's real. The potato is a similar case of a good origin story attaching itself to a famous name. The potato is native to South America, and it made its way to Europe through Spanish explorers and traders who encountered it there. Raleigh had nothing to do with that journey. The link to him is a later patriotic embellishment, tidied up and passed along until it hardened into fact, partly because he held estates where the crop was later grown. A whole continent's worth of exploration got quietly compressed into one Englishman's pocket, because a single dashing hero is a better story than a messy web of anonymous traders. Tobacco's the one with a grain of truth, but even that gets twisted. Tobacco was already arriving in England through various hands by the time Raleigh became famous. What he genuinely did was help make pipe smoking fashionable among the glittering set at court, turning it into a stylish habit for the wealthy and modish. That is a real thing he did, and it matters. But making something trendy is not the same as introducing it, however much the legend prefers the bigger claim. He was the influencer, not the inventor. So why does everything stick to this one man? Because Raleigh was a genuinely spectacular figure, and spectacular figures act like magnets for stray legends. He really was a bold adventurer, a favourite of the Queen, a backer of ambitious voyages across the ocean, a hunter of distant treasure, a poet, a courtier, and eventually a prisoner who met a dramatic end. A life that vivid becomes a convenient peg to hang anecdotes on. When people want a colourful origin for some object or gesture, they reach for the colourful man, and the story finds a comfortable home on his reputation. You do exactly the same thing today. Think of how the most famous, quotable celebrities and geniuses end up credited with clever lines and daring deeds they had nothing to do with, simply because attaching the story to a household name makes it travel further and land harder. Fame is a gravitational field, and loose facts fall into it. Raleigh, being one of the brightest stars of his age, pulled in more than his fair share. He led a genuinely dramatic life, which is exactly why so much invented drama got draped over it. And talking of things wrongly assumed to be timeless Tudor tradition, let's carve into Christmas dinner. You imagine a Tudor Christmas table groaning under a magnificent roast turkey, exactly like yours, because surely that's timeless. Turkey had in fact only just arrived from the New World during the Tudor century. A strange exotic bird that a handful of wealthy adventurous eaters were only beginning to try. But it was nowhere near the standard festive centrepiece. Your average grand Tudor feast was far more likely to star goose, capon, beef, or, for the truly showy, a boar's head paraded in with great ceremony. Consider the timing, because it makes the whole assumption absurd. The turkey is a bird of the Americas, and it only crossed the ocean to reach English shores partway through the Tudor era. So for a good chunk of the century, the turkey you consider a Christmas essential simply was not present in the country at all. Expecting it on an early Tudor table is like expecting your great-great-grandparents to have owned a television. The thing hadn't arrived yet, and when it did, it was a novelty rather than a fixture. When it finally showed up, it was a curiosity for the rich and the daring, an exotic foreign bird to be tried and shown off precisely because it was new and unusual. A wealthy, fashionable host might serve one to impress guests with his worldliness, the way someone today might present a trendy imported delicacy. But that is the opposite of tradition. It was the flashy newcomer at the party, not the guest of honour everyone expected. So what was actually the star of a grand Tudor Christmas? Something far more established. A fine, fat goose was a classic festive roast, rich and flavourful. Capon, a plump, specially raised bird, graced many a wealthy table. Great joints of beef and cuts of venison spoke of abundance and status. And for the truly grand household showing off its wealth, nothing beat the theatre of a boar's head, garnished and garlanded, carried into the hall in a grand ceremonial procession, to the delight and awe of the assembled diners. That was the showstopper, not a turkey. It helps to remember that Christmas itself was a very different beast, a sprawling feast season of 12 days rather than a single lunch. For those who could afford it, it was a long, glorious stretch of eating, drinking, music, games, and revelry, with tables piled high across many days. Abundance was the whole point, and the abundance took many forms, few of which involved the specific bird you now consider mandatory. Variety and spectacle mattered more than any single centrepiece. The turkey's rise to its throne as the definitive Christmas bird came much later, generations after the Tudors, when changing tastes and a famous sentimental Christmas story helped cement it as the festive default in the popular imagination. It's a genuinely recent tradition dressed up as an ancient one, which is a very common trick. So many things we assume are timeless turn out to be surprisingly young, invented within a couple of centuries and then quietly backdated in our minds to the dawn of time. So your turkey is not the ghost of Christmas past. It's a relative latecomer that muscled its way to the head of the table long after the Tudors were gone, elbowing aside the goose and the boar's head that actually ruled the season. Handing it a starring role at every Tudor feast is a comfortable modern assumption with no real footing in the period. And since we've arrived at the end of the feasting, it's nearly time for bed, which hides yet another lie. You picture crawling into a big soft Tudor bed and sleeping straight through until the rooster, because what else would anyone possibly do at night? 2 surprises are waiting for you. First, many Tudor people didn't sleep in one solid block at all. They had a first sleep and a second sleep, waking naturally in the middle of the night to pray, talk, tend the fire, or simply lie there thinking before drifting back off again. To them this was completely normal. Second, that popular idea that sleep tight refers to tightening the ropes under the mattress is a tidy little story with no real evidence behind it. Let's linger on that segmented sleep because it's one of the most quietly fascinating things about the era, and rather soothing to think about as you lie here. Before the night was flooded with artificial light, people commonly slept in 2 distinct shifts. The first sleep began not long after darkness fell, since there was little else to do once the light was gone. Then, a few hours later, in the deep middle of the night, people simply woke up. Not in a panic, not tossing and turning, just awake, calmly, as a normal part of the night's rhythm. And this waking hour, the quiet gap between the 2 sleeps, was its own gentle little world. People used it for all sorts of things. Some prayed in the stillness, feeling it a peaceful, holy time. Some talked softly with whoever shared the bed. Some rose to tend the fire, check on animals, or step outside. Some visited neighbours, and some simply lay there in the dark thinking, letting their minds wander through the day. Then, when the drowsiness returned, they sank into the second sleep and rested until dawn. Nobody found this strange. It was just how the night worked, so ordinary that people barely bothered to explain it in their writings, which is exactly why we forgot about it. What erased the pattern was light. As brighter artificial lighting spread and pushed bedtimes later and later, the long night compressed, the middle gap closed up, and we gradually consolidated our rest into a single unbroken block. The 2 sleep rhythm faded from memory so completely that we now treat one solid stretch of sleep as the natural, correct, only way, and we panic when we can't manage it. Which brings a genuinely comforting thought for anyone lying awake right now. That familiar jolt of waking somewhere in the small hours staring at the ceiling, convinced something is wrong with you because you can't sleep straight through, might be nothing more than a faint echo of that ancient natural rhythm resurfacing. Your body may simply be doing something people did contentedly for countless generations. The wakefulness is not necessarily a malfunction. It may be a memory. As for sleeping tight, the popular explanation is a charming little invention. People love to say the phrase comes from old beds strung with ropes that had to be tightened to keep the mattress firm, so sleeping tight meant sleeping on a well-tautened bed. It's a satisfying image, and it's almost certainly false. There's no real evidence for it, and the word tight has long simply meant soundly, securely, snugly. Wishing someone to sleep tight most likely just meant wishing them a good, sound rest. No ropes required. So your night in Tudor England is stranger and gentler than you expected, quietly broken into 2 peaceful halves. And that made-up phrase is the perfect doorway into the greatest myth machine of them all. At some point, a viral message landed in your inbox or your family group chat, confidently explaining that a whole basket of everyday phrases was born in this exact era. It's raining cats and dogs, apparently, because animals slept up in the thatch and tumbled through whenever it rained. People were supposedly so broke they lived in dirt-floored poverty and had nowhere private to relieve themselves. The saying about throwing the baby out with the bathwater supposedly came from a whole family sharing one tub of increasingly filthy water. Every last bit of it is invented. That entire list comes from a joke message that spread around the internet in the early 2000s, cheerfully explaining the supposedly grim origins of dozens of common phrases, all conveniently rooted in the 1500s. It's the kind of thing a well-meaning relative forwards with the subject line, "You won't believe this," and it's almost entirely nonsense, a piece of folk history someone made up for fun that then escaped into the wild and bred like rabbits. The pattern of the fake explanations is always the same, and once you spot it, you can't unsee it. Take a common phrase, invent a vivid, slightly gross little scene from the past to explain it, and make that scene as memorable as possible. Cats and dogs tumbling from a soaked thatched roof. A grim shared bath where, by the time the poor baby was washed last, the water was so murky you might genuinely lose the child in it. A house so wretched it defined a whole phrase about poverty. Each one paints a colourful picture that lodges instantly in the memory, which is precisely why they spread so well and why they're so hard to dislodge. But the real origins of these phrases are almost always murkier, duller, or completely different from the tidy tale. Some are genuinely old, some are far younger than the 1500s, and most have origins that scholars either argue about endlessly or simply can't pin down at all. The truth, as usual, is a shrug and a maybe, which is deeply unsatisfying, and unsatisfying explanations lose every single time to a confident, gross, specific story, even when the confident story is pure fiction. Here's the truly delicious part, though. This is fake history about the making of history. It's a myth about where myths and words come from, which makes it the perfect specimen to end our collection on. And it's spread by exactly the mechanism this whole night has been about. A good, vivid, shareable story beating a boring, complicated truth over and over until enough people repeat it that it feels like common knowledge. It's the flat earth, the plague rhyme, and the burning witches all over again, just wearing the costume of etymology. And you almost certainly fell for it, at least once. You read that clever little list, felt a warm glow of, I never knew that, and filed it away as fact, ready to deploy at a dinner party. That warm glow, that satisfying click of a neat explanation snapping into place, is exactly the feeling that lets bad history travel so far and so fast. The more pleasing the story, the less we bother to check it, which is a lesson worth carrying well beyond the 1500s. So the next time a too perfect origin story arrives, with the confident air of secret knowledge, treat it with a raised eyebrow. It's probably a modern invention in an old costume, which brings us to the biggest, softest, most comforting lie of them all. And here it is, the myth quietly humming beneath all the others, the cosy one you've half believed this whole time, that Tudor England was a simpler, merrier place, a golden age of maypoles and feasts and honest hard work before life got complicated. It's a beautiful daydream. It's also the biggest lie of the lot. Life here was shorter for many, harder for most, and ruled by disease, hunger, and the terrifying whims of the powerful. But it wasn't the grey cartoon of endless misery either, nor the sanitized fairy tale of the tourist brochure. Understand why the daydream is so seductive, because it says more about you than about the Tudors. Modern life feels relentless, cluttered, and exhausting. A blur of screens and demands and noise, so the mind reaches backward for a picture of something calmer. It conjures a soft focused past of green fields, tight-knit villages, simple pleasures, and honest labour, a world without the endless complications you carry now. It's a comforting fantasy, a place to mentally retreat when the present overwhelms. The trouble is it never existed. Strip away the nostalgic glow and Tudor life was genuinely brutal for the vast majority of people. Disease could empty a household in a week with no warning and no cure. A single failed harvest meant real hunger, sometimes starvation. Work was back-breaking, endless and offered no safety net if your body gave out or your luck ran dry. Your fate could be upended overnight by the mood of a landlord, a lord, or a distant monarch against whom you had no real recourse. Simpler, in the sense the daydream means, it was not. It was precarious in ways that would terrify you. But here is the crucial other half, the half the grim cartoon gets wrong. It was not a joyless grey slog of suffering either. These were vivid, colourful, fully alive people. They laughed uproariously, sang and danced, played games, drank and feasted when they could, fell in love, told filthy jokes, gossiped viciously, cheated and forgave, dreamed and schemed. Their streets were bright with colour, their festivals loud with music, their taverns warm with life. They were funny, clever, cruel, kind, petty and brave, often all in the same afternoon. They were, in every way that counts, exactly as human as you are. That is the real truth hiding behind every myth we've turned over tonight. The past was neither the enlightened cartoon where our ancestors were simple fools who thought the world was flat and never washed, nor the cosy fairy tale where everything was merrier and cleaner and kinder than now. It was a real place full of real people, no wiser and no more foolish than you, just handed a much harder set of cards and playing them with the same stubborn mix of misery and joy that defines every human life. Each lie we've untangled was in the end a story we told ourselves to make the past simpler than it was, either to feel superior to those who came before or to envy a golden age that never happened. The messy, colourful, contradictory truth is stranger and richer than either, and far more worth knowing. The Tudors don't need our pity or our envy. They just deserve to be seen as they were, in all their difficult, vivid, wildly human reality. So as you finally let your eyes close tonight, warm and safe and cared for in ways they could scarcely have imagined, spare a soft thought for them, the real ones, laughing and struggling and dreaming 500 years ago. The truth, as always, sits somewhere the legends flatly refuse to go. And that, comfortingly, is exactly where we'll rest tonight. So there you have it. A whole night spent gently pulling the loose thread on everything you thought you knew about Tudor England, and watching the tidy legends quietly unravel, one after another. You wouldn't have dropped dead the moment you turned 30. You wouldn't have reeked from a lifetime of never washing. Your teeth weren't doomed to rot black. The earth was never thought flat. England's witches weren't burned at the stake, and poor Anne Boleyn never had that famous sixth finger. Even the clever little sayings turned out to be modern inventions wearing old costumes. Almost everything the films and the forwarded messages told you was, at best, a beautiful exaggeration. But underneath all those busted myths sat something far better than any legend. Real people. People who washed with cold water and rose water, who laughed with their imperfect teeth, who knew the world was round and the well water was mostly safe, who worked and worried and gossiped and dreamed. They were not simpler than you, and they were not merrier. They were just as clever, just as foolish, and just as stubbornly, wonderfully human, handed a far harsher set of cards and playing them with grit and humour anyway. So tonight, as you settle into your warm, soft bed, with clean water a tap away, medicine in the cupboard, and a whole world of knowledge glowing quietly in your pocket, spare a gentle thought for them. The real Tudors, not the cartoon villains or the fairy tale peasants, but the flesh and blood people who lived, struggled, and found their reasons to smile 500 years ago. Because history is never a tidy story with simple lessons. It's messier, funnier, and far more human than that. And that, in the end, may be the most comforting truth of all. So rest easy now, breathe slow, and let the old legends fade softly into the dark,